Hello, and welcome to today's Fenwick Elliott webinar. My name is Stacey Sinclair, and we are delighted to have so many of you with us here today. I am joined by my colleagues and partners, Dave Bebb and Lucinda Robinson, both of which specialize in all things construction and energy law related, construction contracts, appointments, dispute resolution, advising a range of employers, contractors, consultants, and suppliers. And today, Dave and Lucinda are going to be looking at a back to the basics topic, starting off on the right foot, how to ensure there's some clarity on contract terms from day one. Now, I say back to the basics, but if the basics were so straightforward and easy to get right, we would not be here with you today discussing such a topic, one which is so important to get right at the outset if you want to achieve that clarity, transparency, and ultimately a successful outcome. So first, a bit of housekeeping. Please do ask questions as we go. The questions box you will find on the right-hand side of your screen in that toolbar. And I will put those questions anonymously at the end to both Dave and Lucinda. Also, rest assured, a copy of today's slides and an on-demand recording of the session will be available on our website in due course. So with that, I shall hand over to Dave and Lucinda. Thank you.
Thanks, Stacey. Good morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. Today, as Stacey says, we're going to scroll right back to the very beginning of a contract and look at how it is put together in the first place and how to get that right, so that, in theory, we limit the potential for trouble later on. Dave and I are going to cover why we have contracts at all, how contracts are formed, battle of the forms, a bit on letters of intent, and also third-party agreements and how they might impact upon your contract. Starting off right at the very beginning, well, why does this matter? Why are we talking about this at all? And I think it boils down to three main reasons, which are the reasons why we have contracts. The first one, of course, is quoted a lot, and that is certainty. So contracts are there to give us some certainty, for example, about what is to be supplied, to what standard, when, and for what purpose. And that certainty is key because it enables businesses to make forecasts and plan for the future based on what they know to be their rights and obligations. And we tend to find in the courts that certainty will be preserved. So if it looks like your contract says something, then even if that amounts to a bad bargain or might seem a little bit unfair, generally that's tough. Another reason is that contracts allow us to manage risk. Businesses spend millions of pounds on construction projects every year, but these projects are inherently risky, and contracts help us to manage that by allocating those risks to the different parties. And finally, contracts help us solve problems. So I'm a disputes lawyer, and if anybody comes to me with a dispute to sort out, my first question is going to be, can I have a copy of the contract, please? Because that's going to be the starting point every time for working out how to resolve the problem at hand. I need to know what the relevant terms are, who is entitled to what law applies even, and quite often there is a handy dispute resolution clause in there somewhere that will help us plan a route map for getting out of the problem. But what if there isn't a beautifully signed and dated, shiny and bound contract? What if there isn't a contract, or there's more than one contract, or it's not clear as to whether there's a contract, or it's not clear what terms are incorporated, or how those terms sit together? Well, then what? When it comes to working out the underlying issue and how to solve that, we're in a spot of bother. We don't have certainty, the risk isn't managed, and we haven't solved a problem, we've created one. And my favourite illustration of this is a case of RTS and Muller, partly because it involves a yoghurt packaging plant, and I like to think about food when I'm working, and partly because it's just a really good example of what can go wrong if the contract isn't set up well in the first place. So in this one, Muller engaged RTS to design and install a new packing line for a manufacturing plant. And a dispute arose over various matters. There were defects, delay, related costs, bit of everything. But before it could all be unscrambled and resolved, the parties had to work out, first and foremost, is there a contract? And if so, what terms apply to that contract? At first instance, the judge decided there was a contract, but that the terms implied at law were relevant and no others. The Court of Appeal disagreed and decided there was no contract at all. And then eventually in the Supreme Court, it held there was a contract, but on a set of terms that the parties were negotiating based on MF1. So that's 3 courts, 9 judges, 3 decisions, and goodness knows how much time and money before they could even look at the real issues in the case that were affecting their business. And those were settled, probably well and truly sick of litigation by then, I should imagine. More recently is another example involving Balfour Beatty and Van L. So here, Van L had carried out some piling works to support a large structure known as the North Carousel for Balfour Beatty. The piling has had to be replaced and the North Carousel taken down and then eventually put back together again. There was a subcontract on this one, but Van L tried to say it did not apply to the North Carousel, and instead they argued that their terms and conditions, which contained a nice little limited liability clause and that had been attached to their quotation way back at the beginning of things, applied to that instead. The court had none of this. It said that on the documents, Van L had clearly wanted assurance that its quotation was accepted and they wanted something in writing. Balfour's had provided that in the form of a letter of intent, and that covered the North Carousel. And that letter of intent was eventually superseded and replaced by the subcontract, which in turn also covered the North Carousel works. So yet again, we have another issue where it's not clear what terms people have contracted on. And as you will see through the course of this presentation, these often come up when there is a limit of liability at stake, because quite rightly, parties want to rely on it if they can. So if you are in one of these pickles and you're not sure if a contract has been formed or which terms apply, what do? Well, you apply the rules of contract formation, and I expect these are quite familiar to people, so we'll just canter through. You will know already that there's 4 ingredients for a contract: offer, acceptance, consideration, and intention. I'm taking them out of order because it suits my purposes here. The consideration is the deal. So that's the bit where the parties are exchanging something for value. And that's generally cash for construction works or services in our situations. Intention is also sometimes quite straightforward. It is generally assumed that there is intention to create legal relations in commercial transactions, unless there's evidence to show that that intention isn't there. And the classic way to do that is to slap that phrase we're all familiar with, subject to contract, onto the documents that are going backwards and forwards. And that phrase, subject to contract, and the protection it offers is very much alive and kicking. And there was a recent Court of Appeal case, Joanne Properties, that confirms as much. So most of the time, if you're using subject to contract, that will be a good indicator that you're not actually at a contract just yet. So provided you have consideration and intention, how do you know when your contract is formed? Well, it's going to happen when an offer is accepted. So when an offer is made, there could be one of various responses. A rejection is going to kill it so that it's no longer on the table. Silence generally doesn't amount to an acceptance, not on its own anyway. You might get a request for further information, and that will just be what it says on the tin, a request for further information. It's not accepting the offer. The two that cause us a bit more trouble are the counteroffer and acceptance. So the counteroffer is quite a common response. This will reject the first offer and sit as an offer in its own right, which will need to be accepted before a contract can be formed. And then, of course, there's an acceptance, which takes you to a contract. Now, the acceptance, to qualify as an acceptance, needs to be unambiguous, and it needs to be communicated verbally, in writing, emails, fine, or by conduct. Once you have an acceptance that matches your offer, you have a contract. And later documents that try to change the terms of that contract or add something else in, unless they're accepted, and they're not likely to influence the contract itself. So the thing that can cause the trouble is if it's not clear whether the response you're dealing with is a counteroffer or an acceptance, and that can be the sort of yes but issue. And this quite often comes up in battle of the forms scenarios, which you'll be familiar with. So these are where you have effectively a competition to see whose terms and conditions win. And it happens when both parties are entering into a deal and each is trying to assert their own terms and conditions. How do you win? You have to fire the last shot. And what that means is the court will do the offer and acceptance analysis to determine when the contract was formed, and the winning terms will be those on the table at the point the contract is made. Fortunately, it's not always very clear cut. So let's have a look at 3 examples of cases dealing with Battle of the Forms scenarios. The leading case comes from the Court of Appeal, and it's Tech Data and Amphenol. Tech Data had been buying connectors from Amphenol for years, and they got into an argument about quality and delay on one particular transaction. Tech Data argued that the terms of its purchase order applied, but Amphenol insisted its order acknowledgement, referring to its own terms with a limit on liability, applied. Amphenol was right, and the Court of Appeal made a statement which is often quoted and very useful for our purposes. It said, where A makes an offer on its T's and C's, and B accepts that offer on its T's and C's, and without more performance follows, the correct analysis, assuming that each party's T's and C's have been reasonably drawn to the attention of the other, is that there is a contract on B's T's and C's. Now, other cases have followed this, and a good one, taking them slightly out of order on the slide, is Trebor, Bassett and Cadbury's. So here, another memorable one, because food is involved, there was a fire in a popcorn factory, but the fire suppression system didn't work. Cadbury's and Trebor sued the supplier, ADT, who wanted to rely on its terms and conditions because of the limit of liability inside them. Could they? Well, the Battle of the Forms played out like this. ADT sent a quotation referring to terms and conditions, but not attaching them. There was no evidence that they had been provided previously. Cadbury's sent a purchase order referring to T's and C's already supplied and available on request. Then the work started. Who won? Well, following Tech Data, Cadbury's did. There was no challenge to its T's and C's before works began. It had fired the last shot. So Cadbury's were party B in the Tech Data quote. Looking at transformers and needs, and I should say that the picture of the transformer is not the sort of transformer that they're actually talking about, but it helps me remember the name of the case, so I've put it in. And who doesn't like Bumblebee? So here the parties have been trading for over 20 years, with transformers placing weekly orders. On one transaction, transformers complained that the goods it purchased from Needs were not fit for purpose. Needs argued its liability was limited by its terms and conditions. Whose terms applied? In this case, neither of them did. And actually, the contractual setup was a complete mess. So Transformers had printed its T's and C's on the back of its purchase orders, but it didn't refer to them on the front. And this is a classic error, actually. I've seen several times. I've seen it catch people out, and I've also seen it where people do refer to them on the front of their purchase orders, and it's really helped them. So that's a tip for the future. So Transformers have printed the T's and C's on the back, but not the front. They hadn't referred to them on the front. And then in order to get them across to Needs, they had sometimes faxed them, sometimes posted, and sometimes emailed. And when they were faxed or emailed, you couldn't see the T's and C's. And you didn't have any notice of them because they weren't referred to on the front of the document. They only came through when the orders had been posted. Needs issued order acknowledgements referring to terms and conditions, but it had never sent its terms and conditions. And its delivery notes, which also referred to terms of a contract, they didn't refer back to the same terms and conditions that the order acknowledgement did. This time they just talked about terms in a contract, whatever that was, or purchase order. So relying on Tech Data, the court said in this case, neither party had done enough to bring their own terms to the other's attention. So actually neither of them were included in that case. So where does this really take us? Well, it's a bit difficult to reconcile all the cases because they do tend to be very fact dependent. However, we can extract some principles, and as you'll see, these tend to tie back to what the court said in Tech Data. Generally, the court is going to follow the traditional offer and acceptance approach to find the point at which the offer is accepted. If performance follows the unchallenged acceptance of an offer or a counteroffer, then that offer or counteroffer is going to be the last shot and it will take effect. Again, that takes you back to the Tech Data quote. The terms need to have been reasonably drawn to the other party's attention, as we can see again, Tech Data and Transformers. And just a word of warning on this one, generally speaking, if there are particularly onerous clauses or significant clauses, they are going to need to be brought to the other party's attention with more force. So the classic quote from Lord Denning from years ago in Sperling and Bradshaw is they need to be printed in red ink on the face of the document with a red hand pointing to it. So if you want your limits on liability to apply, you need to make very sure that they are included in your contract, and if you're relying on standard T's and C's, you need to draw attention to it by putting it in bold, mentioning it on the front of the document or something along those lines. So just a couple of other points to note before I pass on to Dave. The first one is, what do you do if your particular facts mean that the traditional offer and acceptance analysis is not going to take you to the answer that you want? So what commonly parties try to do is demonstrate that there's been a course of dealing within which their terms apply, and this can trump the traditional approach. And this is confirmed in tech data and also in transformers. However, the course of dealings needs to be consistent and unequivocal. So you really do need a strong and firm and clear pattern of these course of dealings. Now, it doesn't have to be very long, actually. Again, in transformers and tech data, the suggestion is that only 3 or 4 occasions, even within a short period of time, might be enough to show a course of dealing. But again, it's going to be very fact dependent. And the final point here to note is that sometimes linked with Battle of the Forms arguments is an idea or is a question around how many contracts there actually are. So I've seen this several times where you have, for example, concrete deliveries where there might be one project, but actually several orders are placed, many orders can be placed, and questions have been asked, does each one of those orders constitute a separate contract, or are they all part of the same one? And I've seen it similarly with other building materials and also with works orders, for example, under maintenance arrangements. And they do sometimes go hand in hand with Battle of the Forms because it crops up where the contract situation isn't particularly clear. And it's been considered recently in ex novo and MPS housing. And I think it's worth just looking at this because it shows quite a practical approach on behalf of the judge. This was actually an adjudication enforcement hearing, and jurisdiction was challenged on the basis that there was more than one contract. It was a situation where there had been some discussions around a deal for maintenance works on properties, and there were a series of call-off orders relating to works on 32 empty properties. Now, the defendant argued that there were multiple contracts for these works, so the adjudicator did not have jurisdiction, and the defendant could resist enforcement and didn't have to hand over the cash. The claimant, on the other hand, said that all the various exchanges about contract terms did relate to just one single contract, which had been subject to some variations along the way. Now, the judge decided that there was a single contract and not multiple contracts, and his reasoning boiled down to one very interesting point, it seems to me, and that is that standing back and looking at the nature of the dealings, common sense told him that there was one contract with call-offs, as all the works and instructions were linking back to one project with one start date. So ultimately, it just looked like one project. So that is worth bearing in mind if you find yourself in that situation. So one final word, and then I will hand over to Dave. And that word on contract formation is just caution. These cases are never clear-cut and they are highly fact-sensitive. So it can be really difficult to predict who the winner is going to be. If you want your terms to apply, you have to make it as difficult as possible for a judge or an adjudicator to find that anything else applies, ideally by getting yourself a nice signed contract document that everybody has put their name on. But if that's not possible, then you need to have made sure that you enforce your terms as much as possible and refer to your terms as much as possible and keep sending them over in the negotiation process. And with that, Dave, you have control of the slides.
Right, okay. Right, letters of intent. Good afternoon, everyone. I think a talk on starting a job off on the right foot, I think you'd all feel quite short-changed if I hadn't touched on letters of intent at some point, given how many projects start with a letter of intent. Whenever I do these talks face-to-face, and let's hope they will come soon, always have a show of hands as to anybody who's had a few projects that have started without a letter of intent, and there's very few hands get raised in the room. Okay, I think there's a mindset, isn't there, in the construction industry that it must start with a tender, tender acceptance, a negotiation, a letter of intent, then a building contract. There's that mindset. Letter of intent is a sort of compulsory stage in the project. But as Lucinda's touched on, letters of intent are absolutely ripe for issues to arise in terms of problems. Okay. The purpose of my sort of slot today is not to talk you through everything about letters of intent. I think it's probably fair to say that it's been rammed home enough to all of you by construction lawyers, everyone else over the time, that you know roughly what to look for. I mean, the classic case, isn't it? It lands on your desk on a Friday afternoon for a start on a Monday. It's what, 2, 3, 4 pages long. Quick pen goes out, you tick the bit, what am I being asked to do? You tick the bit to say, am I going to be paid? And then generally you've probably lost interest by then in terms of looking through that letter of intent. So I'm not going to go over the basics. Everyone I think knows roughly what the basics are to look for. We all know that a comfort letter, it's our intention to give you a job, is not enough. We want something more in there. My second bullet point, it's really interesting though, is you must assume that the whole job is built under it. Now, Lucinda's touched on most of our projects, of course. If you see life with your glass half full, your letter of intent will, in a couple of weeks' time, turn into a properly signed contract and everyone is happy. There is clarity going forwards. The sort of jobs that arrive on our desks, of course, are the 5–10% maybe where that never happens. But as again, you should always really assume that the whole job is built on the back of a letter of intent. Now, that means, of course, is that they really should have the same level of scrutiny as a full contract. You may only have 4 or 5 pages, but should you look at that just as carefully as looking at 120 pages? I would say yes, if you want that certainty. The problem we've touched on, of course, is trying to get certainty. Most letters of intent are completely bespoke. There is nothing you can pull off the shelf, like a JCT letter of intent or an NEC. They can't be pulled off the shelf. So there's always an element of uncertainty because all these letters of intent say different things. But what is true, and I've been doing this for 20 years now, a lot of copy and pasting goes on, is that here's one we did earlier. All we need to do, folks, is change the name, and sometimes even that is not done correctly. Slot some different figures in, and Bob's your uncle. That's done on the page 1. Okay, so that flags up all sorts of problems. Just bear in mind again, remember that, as Lucinda's touched on, a contract is all about certainty. 5 pages of letter of intent cannot cover the same number of what-if scenarios that 120 pages of a building contract can cover. They just can't do it, which sort of comes into my penultimate bullet point there. That's an attempt by lawyers, and these are all examples of letter of intent I've come across over the years. What they try and do to give that certainty, of course, is say, well, we haven't got a full building contract, but what we'll try and do is sneak it in the back by saying that all those terms, as in those 120 pages of certainty, they apply to my 5 pages of letter of intent. So you get phrases like this. Although we've not entered into the contract, all those terms apply. Okay. On the face of it, so that's all very clear, isn't it? That works. So if I were to burn the building down, I can point to a clause in the contract that says what happens. That's fine, but remember, anyone who's familiar with JCT or NEC or whatever it might be, these contracts only work, don't they, if you fill the blanks in at the front. So take a typical JCT, what's that? It must be about 10 pages of what they call contract particulars at the beginning. They're quite important bits, really, aren't they? That's the bit about when do we start, when do we finish, who takes out the insurance, does retention apply, when do I get my money, when do I apply for all these bits are trying to be incorporated into a building contract, but I suspect they've maybe not been thought about or finalised because the letter of intent is the Friday afternoon job for the start on a Monday morning. So the chances are that may not work. And there's a little case recently where exactly that happened. OD developed an oak dry lining last year. This was actually as a result of an adjudication. We don't see all the terms of the letter of intent in the judgment, but if I was a betting man, I know roughly what's in there. Okay. This was OD Developments engaging Oak as its dry lining contractor, and it's the classic tick all the boxes. Letter of intent talks about all great intentions. There's the second bullet point. We confirm it's our intention to enter into the contract. You'll recognise that from almost every first paragraph of every letter of intent that lands on your desk. And as Lucinda alluded to, guess what? The entire job was built off the back of a letter of intent. No contract was ever signed. That's quite familiar. I had a hotel job last year where we got to £17 million of the construction off the back of 17 letters of intent. Nothing ever got signed. Okay. What did happen in practice, though, of course, is that even though no contract is signed, the parties roughly do a pretty good job of following it. So in this case is that no JST contract signed, but applications for payment were generally made around about the right time. Payment was made around about the right time, and the inevitable final account dispute happened, but there was no building contract. The adjudicator, when he was appointed, went off and said, well, I can see what's happened here. There's an intention to enter into a building contract. I can see roughly that all those bits that would be in the contract particulars bit have probably been agreed. We know roughly what program we're working to. We know the price. We know what we're building, but it was never actually filled in. So the adjudicator said, I think that building contract is incorporated and therefore that is the terms. Okay. What that meant for OD was quite useful because remember, JCT in the back of it has a concept of a final certificate or a final payment, i.e. if you don't shout out within a number of days, that's the final valuation of that bit of work. It's what they call this conclusive effect, the conclusivity of a final certificate. That was quite handy for OD because they could say, well, this is the end of the matter. You can't now dispute this, subcontractor. So anyway, it goes off to court. And this is the interesting bit. The judge said here, and I quote that in just a little bit, it's one thing to agree what documents you will have if you sign a building contract. So again, a typical letter of intent will say, we intend to sign a building contract and we intend these documents to form part of it, okay? But he went on to say it's quite another thing to say that you've incorporated all those terms. So on that basis, despite the fact that it talked about the form of contract, despite the fact the parties had operated it and never said they hadn't, judge turned around and said, no, not incorporated. So I think the lesson learned there, and again, it's as Lucinda touched on, very, very fact specific, but it can be the toss of a coin as to whether that building contract is incorporated into that letter of intent. So the lesson learned there is to think very carefully when you're skimming down that letter of intent and it talks about an intention or incorporation of a building contract, never assume that that is watertight, okay? Touch on now, again, back to Lucinda's point really about this 120 pages of a building contract is there for protection. So Lucinda mentioned the fact that it's nice to have in there a little bit of limit of liability you might try and squeeze in if something goes wrong. The thing that's really important is insurance in building contracts. Anyone who listened to my webinar, I think it was last November, on options A, B, C in JST insurance. JST insurance option C is quite useful for a contractor because in effect it can say, even if we are unfortunate enough to burn your building down or flood your building, that's not our lookout. The logic being that the contractor gets the benefit of the overall policy. Okay, so again, looking at a letter of intent, the risk of burning the building down is just as high on the Wednesday, having started on the Monday, as it is in week 32 of the project. It seems to me that risk sits there. And that contract, if you choose the option C bit, comes to the rescue of the contractor, if that's the case. So whenever looking at a letter of intent, skim down and just see what it says about insurance. And this is one I took out from another letter of intent I saw recently. On the face of it, I could see a lot of people reading this thinking, well, that's nearly there, isn't it? It talks about we as in the employer putting in place insurance of the existing building. I'm familiar with that. That's sort of what the building contract says. And then it mentions these specified perils things. So that's great. So that's fire and flood. I know what those are. But does that get the contractor the benefit of the get out of jail card for the fire on the Wednesday? I would say no. All it says is the employer, it's just a statement, the employer is putting in place that insurance. Doesn't mention about letting the contractor off the hook. Doesn't mention about putting the contractor on that joint insurance. So you could look at that and think I've got the cover, but it's not enough to get you there, I would suggest. So if you are unfortunate enough as the contractor to set fire to the building on the Wednesday, that's not going to get you out of jail. You need far more. You want absolute clarity in that letter of intent. That is, remember, it's a contract in its own right. It might only be 3 or 4 pages, but you want all the stuff that protects you, whether you're an employer or the client, in those few pages. It's exactly the same point that Lucinda touched on with the Van L case in terms of getting that limitation of liability clearly within there, okay? Another one that always leaps out as well is, remember the fact that the letter of intent is just a contract, okay? So as a contractor, when I've tendered the job, I know what I'm tendering. I'm tendering NEC terms, or I'm tendering JCT terms, or MF1 terms. I know roughly the risk I'm pricing, despite the fact that some lawyer might flip that risk around. I sort of know where I'm starting. Always bear in mind that letter of intent certainly should be no more onerous than the contract I've priced, should it? But sometimes you'll see bits in there that actually make it far worse for you. So any lawyer will tell you whenever you see the word indemnify, you should circle it with a big red pen. And this is another extract from a letter of intent that says exactly that. You'll indemnify us for any breach of contract. Well, that's quite an onerous obligation on anybody, and certainly far more onerous than anything in the underlying building contract. So those 5 lines there are a significant change in risk profile from the underlying building contract that you might or might not have incorporated. And even if you have incorporated it, how does that clause sit with the underlying building contract? Do they complement one another? Do they conflict with one another? Who knows? Who knows? Next thing I want to touch on is being absolutely clear on what documents form part of the contract. There's a common myth, I think, that us construction lawyers sit in darkened rooms looking at clauses going, well, clause 3.2.5 must mean this. The reality of it is, as Lucinda touched on, is when we get sent a building contract, we are probably the first person to sit down and read every document together. Bear in mind how many people are involved in a typical building contract. Okay, we've got whoever pulled together the tender documents, we've got an estimating team that price it, we've got a commercial team that negotiate it and knock a bit off, we've got a lawyer that might look at just the legal bits, we've got a QS that might look at the pricing bits. Then what happens? All their independent documents are thrown together and someone signs it. Okay, when the lawyer looks at it, they sit there and go, well, hang on a second, this says something completely different to this bit, because Steve didn't talk to Joe and Joe didn't talk to Emma, and they're all different. So a lot of our time is spent trying to unravel what all these different documents say. And there is a tendency as well, a bit like when we go on holiday, of throwing absolutely everything in with the kitchen sink into these contract documents. And that includes everything that even slightly related to construction. So take a typical project, for example. Let's take the development of a brand new office block. Sitting above the employer, there may well be a bank involved. So there's 200 pages of small print about how they'll lend you the money. There may be an agreement for lease with a tenant saying, once we've built it for you, you're going to take the first 10 floors and pay us this much rent. Each of those documents has an element of construction in there. Okay, there'll be something that affects that building contract, which is the main document that deals with construction. I want you to read that clause, but just look at the 2 bits I've highlighted in yellow. So what the contractor is signing up to do is to say, right, I'm going to sign my building contract, and you've thrown all these agreements in there that might or might not relate to construction. And I'm going to make sure that what I do doesn't cause you a problem, employer, is the first bit. And the last thing in the tail is the last few lines. Bear in mind that only some of those agreements exist at the time you sign the building contract. So let's take the speculative office block development, for example. At the time you start knocking up the concrete frame, the landlord hasn't got any tenants, but he's looking really, really hard for them. Okay, these tenants come along as it takes the shape more of a building. So these agreements for lease get signed up post-contract. Okay, so what the second bit is trying to do is saying, not only contractor do you sign up to all the ones that we know exist, you're also signing up to any agreements that you've not yet seen. Okay, but we will send them to you as and when we've let some space in the building. Why is this done? Because that, having just listened to what I've told you about all the problems in agreements in terms of working out one thing that says paint the door blue, another one will say there is no door there, whatever it might be. Why is it done? Well, it's quick. Okay, in the same way that when an employer produces a set of ERs and sends it out to tender, and it comes back realizing that we can't afford anything we've asked for, rather than update all those tender documents to reflect all the VE solutions that contractors suggested, or alternative ways of doing things, or taking things out that the employer can't afford, what they do instead, of course, is having the classic schedule of clarifications or exclusions that just get stapled onto the back of the ERs. What that does is save an awful lot of time with the design team and everyone else updating the documents. It's no different here. If you wanted to take every little bit of a construction-related obligation from all these documents, from the bank loan, from the agreement for lease, and put it in your building contract, it would take a long time. Isn't it much easier just to throw it all in and say, there you go, contractor, you work out which bits are related to construction and make sure you don't cause us a problem. There is a massive, massive risk of conflicts So take a typical agreement for lease, for example. That might say, and it's predominantly a property document, but it will say if this work is not finished by a certain date, all bets are off. So an agreement for lease will call it a long stop date. So basically, if the work goes beyond this time, all bets are off. Okay. Building contracts don't contain that, but as a contractor, I have a date to finish by, and that can get extended in certain circumstances. And if it's not, then I pay you liquidated damages. How do those two obligations sit? What happens if I'm entitled to a full extension of time, but I'm still beyond the long stop date in that other agreement? Don't know the answer to that. Right? Is it an additional obligation? Is there a conflict? What might a court say? Don't know. But all these construction obligations that sit in these other agreements are also in the underlying building contract. Okay. And I think there can be a tendency to, rather like letter of intent, sort of flick through these and think, yeah, I can see it relates to construction, fine, 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 fine. However, anyone who's been unfortunate enough to be involved in a dispute, it can all turn down to the meaning of one little word or a nuance of how a clause is interpreted. Okay. And bear in mind the point Lucinda mentioned as well, is a court is not there to get you out of a bad bargain. A court will not look for inconsistency. You could find a court that could say, well, if you've signed up to an obligation to finish your work by a date, and you've signed up to another obligation that relates to time to finish by a long stop date, those two probably sit quite nicely together. There's just two obligations. Okay. I don't think it necessarily means one trumps the other, but who knows? Okay. The other point I mentioned is about agreements being issued post-contract. Okay. So what a lot of building contracts say is, well, if we enter into that agreement for lease post-contract, we'll send you a copy contractor and you'll read it and you'll make sure you don't cause us a problem. Okay. And it might say, if it does cause you a problem, we'll treat that as a variation. In principle, that's fine, subject to two reasons or two potential problems. First of all, you've got to spot the problem. Okay. It's like looking for a needle in a haystack. Imagine a new agreement for lease, 150 pages, it's issued to the contractor in the middle of the job. How high up the inbox in terms of priority does that have in terms of looking through it? Not much, I would suggest. The other thing, of course, is some things can't actually be valued as a variation, but there's a risk there. I had a project a few years ago where it was refinanced partway through construction, and the new bank came along and said, any building contractor must provide a performance bond. That's a problem for a building contractor who hasn't been asked to provide one at the beginning, because which surety is going to give a bond halfway through a project? They might think, why am I being asked now? So that's what the finance agreement said. The building contract said something different, so there's a clash. Okay. And the reality of the situation is that most variation clauses in building contracts give clients everything they need. They don't need this ability to incorporate these agreements because they can change our work. If the tenant comes in and said, I'd like the work done in a certain sequence, we can do that. If they want the change in scope, we can do that. Working hours to change, that can be done by the variation clause, not by the mechanism of incorporating these other agreements by the back door that can cause so many problems. So I think an awful lot of problems can come just from one little clause and the incorporation of agreements that are only partly related to construction. So that's just a quick canter through 2 or 3 things that I think are useful to do to make sure that the job is set off on the right foot, because it takes a little bit more time, yes, but it adds an awful lot of certainty to the project and saves Lucinda and I an awful lot of trying to work out what the deal might be. Okay, that's more or less, I think, roughly on time, Lucinda. We are 40 minutes in, yeah. So more than happy to take questions if you want to fire some through.
Thank you. So, I mean, spot on the 40 minutes. Well done.
That's not bad at all. Yeah.
Not bad at all. Yeah, thank you so much. I mean, really, yogurt, transformers, haystacks, kitchen sinks. I think we've heard it all, but thank you so much for such a detailed, yet clear and simplified overview of what can be quite complicated issues, as we've just heard. So with the questions, we've had a couple come in. Now, let's move to the first one, which I can see here. Can a contractor terminate a letter of intent? It's usual for the client to have this, right? But it never mentions the contractor.
Oh, okay. Do you want me to take that one, Lucinda?
Yeah, go for it.
Right. Can a contractor terminate a letter of intent? Right, back to basics. There's always a contract, remember. Let's assume that letter of intent has ticked the boxes for contracts. It's done all the bits that Lucinda says it needs to do, okay? And let's assume it doesn't incorporate a standard form contract at the back. It's all going to turn on what its terms say. So unless there's something very clear in there that says the contractor can walk away for whatever reason, you're back to basic common law principles, okay? So certainly the contractor will not be able to walk away. There's no right to terminate. However, what most letters of intent do, or don't do rather, the big elephant in the room is what happens when I finish that bit of work that you've told me to do. Letters of intent are great at saying, we intend to give you the full job, but we're not quite there yet, for whatever reason that might be. In the meantime, please do A, B, C, and D, and we'll pay you £100,000. What happens once A, B, C, and D have been done? Can the contractor say, well, I've done what you've asked for, I'm off because I've got a more exciting and more profitable job down the line? Or does that tender remain open for acceptance? Can the employer instruct the contractor to do more work? Now, in reality, 99% of the time, of course, is that the work keeps getting drip fed through and the contractor's happy to do it because that's what they price and they get paid. So it's great. But there have been instances where contractors thought, do you know what? This is my price that I'd given. I might have missed a trick. So do I get out of a letter of intent? Always very quiet on that as to what might happen. The other thing to look at are expiry dates. So sometimes letters of intent say, this letter of intent falls away on a date. Well, if it falls away on a date, can the employer instruct any more work after that? We would say, well, the letter of intent's fallen away. Where does your right to instruct more work come from? Because this date says it's expired. All these areas are, again, as we've touched on before, it'll all hang on the wording of the letter of intent, but it's by all means not certain. So I think it's safe to assume that the contractor probably doesn't have the right to terminate unless it's in there, but query what happens once they've done the work they've been told to do and paid for. Okay.
And there's always that danger of doing more work than the letter of intent entitles you to be paid for, because there have been contractors that have caught a cropper doing that and only been paid a fraction of the work that they've actually.
Absolutely, yeah, no, totally. Although usually now, I mean, the letter of intent now a little bit clearer in saying, whatever happens, we ain't going to pay you any more than X pounds. But that still is not in enough red pen, Lucinda, for it to jump off the page, or to be actioned at least, anyway. Okay.
Super. Next one. Let's go on to, if there's a risk of the main contract conditions not applying to the work done under a letter of intent, as in the OD case you mentioned, Dave, what is the best way to ensure that as a contractor, we get the benefit of the options C insurance?
Yeah, okay. I think you'd have to write it very, very clearly. And I think I would be looking for words that say it is a standalone provision here, irrespective of whether we do or do not enter into that building contract, for some clarity. But bear in mind, remember, is that the way the insurance works in JC, it's not just one bit I can drop in, it covers a number of different provisions in the building contract. So you'd need some real clarity to say, I think, that the whole of the option C arrangement applies, irrespective of whether or not we ever sign a building contract. It is effectively incorporated into this. But again, it all hangs on the wording of the letter of intent. You just need absolute clarity. Like Lucinda said, there needs to be absolutely no wriggle room to say it is 100% crystal clear what is happening here. No room for intention or what the parties do. It's absolutely crystal clear from day one what happens. Okay.
Thanks, Terry. Next one. Where there are more than two parties to a contract, do all parties need to provide consideration to enforce it?
Can I take that?
More than welcome. There you go.
Thank you. Generally speaking, if you have a simple contract, then any party to it needs to provide consideration. Where we commonly see contracts involving three parties are things like collateral warranties and what have you, and those contracts tend to be set up as deeds rather than simple contracts. And when you're dealing with a deed, you don't need consideration. So in that situation, one of the parties may not need to be giving the consideration. Dave, I don't know if you want to add to that.
No, that's fine. I'm just looking at the next questions coming in, Stacey. Are there a few more?
Yeah, there's a couple more. I think we can certainly squeeze in. How about how likely are contractors to secure a liability cap in their building contracts?
Okay, shall I go for that one? How good's your bargaining position? Right, liability caps. I had this only yesterday on a JC building contract. There are no liability caps in that building contract, except with one narrow liability cap that relates to problems arising from design. There's nothing in the JC building contract that gives you that cap. Do contractors typically ask for them? Probably not. Yeah. Could they ask for them in a really strong bargaining position? Absolutely. Where would the caps most likely be? Delay damages, if I was going to go for something, would be one. But again, as in fairness, I wouldn't say they're commonplace agreeing those caps. Focus tends to be on liquidated damages. It's far more prevalent at subcontractor level. So subcontractors are really, really good at saying, however bad I am, main contractor, I'm only ever on the hook for 10% of my price for delay. So subcontractors are really good at doing that, and actually it's quite common practice. There is less appetite for main contractors to push liability caps up the line. There is much more focus on, is the program realistic? How can I get that extended? And what are the level of LDs? Rather than there comes a point where they are capped. It's far more prevalent, Lucinda, isn't it, on process contracting?
Yeah,
agree.
Absolutely. Yeah,
EWA,
engineering.
Yeah, engineering is far more prevalent to agree caps, but the pure building industry is not where the EPC contractors are in terms of caps on liability. No reason why they couldn't be asked for, though. No reason
Although
why.
subcontractors, as you say, Dave, I see it much more frequently at the subcontractor level, that they're better at asking for caps, and as a result, they're getting.
But predominantly, it is delay that they're interested in. Yeah, on the basis that they could be the one person that the whole liquidated damages bill from the main contract is directed towards. So they're quite clued up at capping that risk. Okay.
Great. Possibly one last one. If using a letter of intent, what are your thoughts on using the City of London Law Society template letter of intent as a starting point?
Oh, okay. I can look at that. When was the last time I looked at that and saw it without any changes? Do you know what? I don't recall the last time I looked at that with any changes, because they all tend to be very little different. I'd have to look at it in light of this and look at it again in terms of tweaks that could be made. Whoever's asked the question, if they want to ping me an email afterwards, I'll look at it again in light of this, although every viewer can look at it again in light of this and critique it in just the same way that I might have to.
There's quite a lot of square brackets in it from memory, so there's a lot to be filled in and a lot to be tailored to the particular job. Yeah. And again, like any contract, you've got to make sure that what it says is what you're happy to live with and what you can work to. So, you know, if you can agree to what's in it as a basic starting point, then that's something. But as Dave said, I've never seen it used without amendment, and commonly adding in the clause you talked about, Dave, where they say, oh, and by the way, the entire kitchen sink applies to this too, is a very common.
Nor how it deals with insurance. I can't recall, to be honest. But whoever's asked it, if they'd like to ping us an email, we will find the answer.
And on that note, if anyone else has any questions on today's session, please do email them in, and we can get back to you. One last question that I can probably field, Dave, although it was directed at you, and it is, you mentioned a previous webinar in November last year on insurance, and is this publicly available? And I will jump in there and say that all of these sessions and the slides are available on demand on the Fenwick Elliott website. You go to the website and go to events and then past webinars, and you can find them all there. And indeed, this one today will be there in due course within a couple of days' time. So I think that takes us spot on to our allocated time. So again, Dave, Lucinda, thank you very much for everything today. And thank you to our audience. for joining us today. There is one last thing I'd like to do, and that is to discuss or introduce you to our next webinar in 2 weeks' time. And actually, 2 weeks' time, that actually brings us to the 1-year anniversary of when we kicked off these Fenwick Elliott webinars. So we thought it would be timely to bring to you construction law in 2021. And Jeremy and I will discuss the key events that have happened over the past 12 months and how they might shape the upcoming year, including the perennial importance of contract negotiation, contract formation, changes in the alternative dispute resolution landscape, and trending topics such as net zero and digital twins. So please join us if you can in 2 weeks' time. For that, the registration link is there at the bottom. And that is that for today. Please do get in touch if you have any further questions. And thank you for joining. We hope to see you again soon.